I'm really personally excited about this session because I first heard about safety differently, safety 2 earlier this year, because listening to a webinar because was working from home, was on lockdown, etc. And I didn't know what it was. And being of a curious nature, I was like, oh, let me go find out a bit more. So I started to research online and came across Kim Bancroft and dropped her a LinkedIn message to connect. And as we were looking at topics for the Chiltern branch, I asked her if she would like, would she be okay to share a bit about what it is about and how it's shown up in her organization. And very grateful for her to have said yes, and it led to us having this session today. And so I also want to thank Kim and David for taking their time to come and share, because they are over in Australia, so pretty late where they are, and for them to take this time. So I want to introduce Kim and David. So Kim is a passionate, future state-driven health and safety leader with 15 years of experience in the industry, and she's currently the head of health and safety at Urban Utilities. And Dr. David Provan is the Managing Director of Forge Works Safety Consultancy, and he has a 20-year career as a safety executive across rail, construction, and the oil and gas industries. And I know David also leads a podcast, and I have listened to several of the podcasts, even though it's in Australia. And again, it's the beauty of LinkedIn and virtual, having things online, is that we can be anywhere in the world and hear and learn from others. So with that, I'll hand over to Kim and David to share more about Safety 2 and its practical applications.
Thanks so much. Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are in the world. Really, Kim and I both really appreciate everyone taking the time to listen to us today and to hopefully engage in some discussion with us and ask us some really interesting questions. Go, and then I've made a mess of it. So what we started in about the mid-80s with high reliability organization theory. So this was when we started having these complex technologies, and we started to want to understand how complex systems fail. So out of Berkeley in the US, we started researching complex large organizations and trying to look at what makes them successful and what makes them unsuccessful. And then as we went into the early 2000s, we started seeing resilience engineering, and we started seeing human performance come out of some of the federal departments in the US, like the Department of Energy and the Department of Defense. And then it was about 10 or 12 years ago where we heard the terms Safety 1 and Safety 2. And these terms came firstly from Eric Holnagel, but they've got basis in organizational theory and management science from 2 decades before then. And so we started hearing these ideas about Safety 1 and Safety 2. I think it's important to realize that Safety 1 isn't actually a thing, and it didn't actually exist. The only reason that we know about Safety 1, or we even talk about Safety 1, is because people started talking about Safety 2 and wanted something to describe all of the other things that it felt wasn't necessarily part of Safety 2. And we lump a lot of these things into the Safety 1 space, and I don't think it's ever really been clearly defined about when we say Safety 1, what exactly are we talking about. But for me, what we're talking about when we talk about Safety 1 is we're talking a lot about prescriptive compliance-based processes and top-down processes in organizations and safety practices which don't match the realities of work and don't set people up to be successful in the work they're trying to perform. So what we really need to think about when we're thinking about Safety 2 is what is the work that people do? How do we set them up to be successful? And how do we make sure that work goes well most of the time? And while I just start with finding this slide share, that's a perfect time for me to hand over to Kim, and she can introduce Urban Utilities and introduce some of the work that they've done there. Okay.
Great, thanks, Dave. So yeah, as Dave said, I'm the head of health and safety at Urban Utilities. We're the wonderful world of water and sewerage in Brisbane. So I can't say we're that exciting, but we are a wonderfully complex organisation full of some pretty incredible people. And yeah, it's really exciting to be here. So big thanks to Melissa for inviting me along to share how we've unpacked the safety 2 theory and to put it into practice. And I get a lot of people asking me, how do I put this into practice? So just want to share with you a few of those things that we've learned along the way. I must start by saying, though, it's definitely not a quick fix. It's not a silver bullet, and I definitely recommend buckling in for the long ride. There's a lot of things that haven't worked in our journey of rolling this out, but certainly a lot of things that have. Dave, the podcast that we mentioned before, Dave's podcast is just brilliant, and that certainly is one of the resources that have helped us along the way in thinking about how we're operationalising it. So some of you might be wondering as you start to survey the landscape of your organisation that you might be interested in starting to roll this out. Some people tend to drip feed it in through their organisation, or in my case with Urban Utilities, when I joined, I found the door wide open and I was able to get in there and start operationalising this pretty quick. So what you can see on the screen there is just a nice little graphic. That's our strategy as a nice one-page graphic to share with individuals who have wondered what we've actually done. It just talks about the different phases that we've gone through. I'm a strong believer in overlaying any rollout of this nature with some kind of change management strategy. So I use Cotter's 8 stages of change. You could certainly use any type of change management. So you can see there, we did a bunch of discovery. It might be a little bit hard to read there. We've got the discovery, the design and implementation phase, the habituation phase, where we put a number of tools and methodologies that we developed off the back of the theory into practice for the outcomes of success that the organisation had predetermined. So that's our strategy and our approach in a nutshell. We are at that 3rd stage now, actually the 4th stage, where we're really now embedding all of the tools and methodologies off the back of the safety 2 theory. Thanks, Dave. So I'm a firm believer, Dave, if you could just flick to the next slide. Thank you so much.
Yep.
Thank you. So one of the first things we did in operationalising safety 2 was to bring all of our leaders into the one room and to give them a chance to hear about this amazing theory. So I cannot overstate the importance of this. If you've got something that you want to tell your people, then you need to give them the opportunity to hear it. You need to give them the opportunity to challenge it, debate it, pull it apart, and then go away and actually put it into practice. So that's exactly what we did. So I built a bespoke 4-day safety leadership program. So this was predominantly focused at leaders. I took all of the theory from Hognagel, from Decker, Todd Conklin, Drew Ray, Dave Proven, David Woods, and I presented it in layman's terms. And I also then built out all of the tools and methodologies, or took them from other places. So I didn't build learning teams as a methodology, that already existed. So introduced that, decluttering from Dave and Drew, this idea of micro experiments and work insights. So put all that together into this nice, neat 4-day safety program. Now you can see there, the safety program is called Safe Simple. Terrible name. I do not recommend you would call it that, because safety is anything but simple. Okay, so some people go, oh, hang on a second, it's not simple. It's like, I agree, let's not get hung up on the name. So the leaders, they came to this program, it was spaced out nicely. And a lot of the leaders that came in, and also the safety professionals, they have been socialised and operate heavily from a very traditional safety paradigm. So as you can imagine, some of them were a little bit reticent in hearing about this theory, which seemed quite new. So you can see there on the bottom left of the slide, there's a couple of caveats we put in place, which was to invite the leaders to always be curious, to demand evidence and think critically, and to question everything. So we didn't ask them just to take this on. We asked them to be really open-minded, to listen to what we were saying, but then to go away and actually put it into practice and come back and tell us if it worked or not. So that worked really well for us at Urban Utilities to get the company on board and get them across the theory and the tools and the methodology. Thanks, Dave. So in total, in rolling out that program, pre-COVID, of course, we've had about 300 leaders and delivery partners and health safety representatives go through that program. And here's some of the feedback that we got. So some people said, it's awesome and exciting content, let's put it to use. We laughed so hard, so obviously we want it to be fun and engaging as well as interesting and useful. Breath of fresh air should be run across the whole business. And the last comment there was that it's the best training I've done, ridiculously interesting and on point. Now, in my opinion, if you're going to pull 4 leaders into a workshop for 4 days, that's very indulgent, that's a lot of time. Yes, the training needs to be interesting, on point, but more importantly, it needs to have some kind of operational value. So that's what we really strive to do in that workshop, is to make sure that it would actually change operational safety at the coalface. Thanks, Dave. So Dave's now going to talk about one of the key ways in which we put that into practice.
Yeah, so we have a choice as safety professionals. We have a choice from, what's our focus and what's our objective understanding, and we can choose to focus on our safety processes and safety practices. So our safety management systems, our audits, our inspections, our investigations, our training courses, our observation programs, all the things that we do in our organizations for safety. And we label that safety work. So that is all of the work activities in our organization that have the primary purpose of trying to make work safe. And then on the other side of the spectrum, we talk about the safety of work, which is when the people are exposed to the risk, how safe is their work? How well is that risk managed? And I think we have for a long time assumed in safety that there's a fairly close and direct connection between all of those safety things that I mentioned in our organization and how safe it is for people that are actually doing their work. And we've got the audit reports that show that everything's fine, and the investigations that just show 1 or 2 little things wrong, and everyone being 100% compliant with their training records. But kind of the fact of the matter is, we still, the ILO estimates somewhere between 3 and 5 million people still die at work every year. Although it's kind of hard to know how to count everybody, which is a huge amount of people every day, thousands of people every day, something like maybe 2,000 people a day. So we need to be critical of ourselves in terms of how comprehensive and how holistic is the way that we're managing safety in our organizations. So this is where we have to have processes that not only come at safety top down, like we're very used to in our organizations, but also come at safety bottom up. So one of the things that becomes really interesting for us, and I might just get the second poll launched, because it looks like from the first poll that there's a lot of people who want to know from the start. And still 7 people, so still 15 or 20 people on the call that are putting safety 2 in practice. So that's cool. So I just want to know what processes you've got in your organization to understand the way that work happens, and these are built. So is it investigations and audits? Do you have a work observation program? Do you do things like after action reviews do you do things like learning teams and other processes like that? So just get a feel for what's going on in your organization. But I think if we think about work, so just for a minute, think about the people in your organization today while we're having a breakfast meeting. How are they working? How do you know? What do you rely on to know that they're doing their job today safely? When you drive your car to the shops, do you do a pre-use inspection on your vehicle? When you take your kid for a bike ride, do you make them sit down and do a JSA with you before you roll out the front gate? So think about the things that we do in our organizations that we uncritically assume manage safety, and think about the way that you manage safety in your own life. And I'm going to bet that most people on this call don't pull out a single thing that they do in their organizations for safety to manage personal risk in their own life. So you can also reflect on the things that you rely on to manage risk. Do you rely on your own judgment, your teamwork, with your family? What do you rely on to manage safety in your own life? And why would we assume that that's any different for our workers when they're at work? So we really create this challenge and this double bind for people in our organizations when we condition them to think about safety through this top-down way. Organizations are funny places. They're very hierarchical and institutional. They're very artificial. The people with the power aren't the people with the knowledge. The people with the knowledge don't have the power to do anything. The people exposed to the risk don't make decisions about how those risks gets managed. And the people who make decisions about how risk gets managed are never personally exposed to the risks. So we have this really funny situation in organizations. That's why I think with safety 2 and safety differently and human and organizational performance, whether you believe it or not, it's at least given organizations and academics an opportunity to think about work from the bottom up and think about the risk from where the people are actually exposed to the risk, in the cockpits, in the trenches, in the banks and supermarkets and trains and everywhere else where we do work. So I sort of say, is from a safety 2 point of view, is work, we need to be obsessed about people's work. We need to be obsessed about how work's happening today, how it's going to happen tomorrow, and what it might mean for risk next week. So this is the starting point for us putting safety 2 into practice. We need to have mechanisms in our organization to get the full picture about work. And by that, I mean, we need trusting environments with open communication. We actually need to get a handle on work as done. And some organizations are working towards putting in place practices and hopefully a climate around the conversation around safety in their organization that enables them to get, the best and most comprehensive possible view about how people do their work. So Kim, do you want to tell us about what you've done at, and more of a good balance here of processes. So Kim, do you want to tell us a bit about what you've done at Urban Utilities to understand how work gets done?
Sure, thanks Dave. So I'm going to give an example and then we'll unpack the process that we're using on the back of it. So we're using, as Dave described there, we're just using a methodology to really simply understand the work as we think it happens according to a procedure or perhaps just in someone's head, and how the work actually happens out on site. So here's a really simple example of how this plays out. So operating a sewage treatment plant obviously comes with a number of inherent risks. Drowning is a key one. So the lagoons and tanks where all of the stuff settles, sludge settles, is aerated and contains fluids where it makes drowning a really, really high risk. So the controls that we have in place to control this risk are, we have a security perimeter fence, we have safety signage, we've got safety guard rails, handrails around all of the open tanks, so on and so forth. And they also have access gates as well. So the gates are there to, obviously for the staff and the contractors to gain access to perform operational and maintenance tasks. So it was actually a board member who was out on site one day and he saw, obviously the setup that we have, and with really good intention to further reduce the risk of drowning on site for maybe perhaps some stray kids that came on site or vandals or perhaps even a worker. They thought we would introduce an extra precaution around 2 years ago, and we installed green operational locks, which you can see in that picture there. They were installed on all the gates in an attempt to access, to limit access to operational staff and access to those particular areas. Now, if you've ever been on a sewage treatment plant, you would know that it's got a very persistent and constant presence of H2S, which is really corrosive. So it's a gas, highly corrosive, especially for things like locks. So within a short period of time, the gas degraded and seized about 90% of these locks on these gates. So some of these gates were just permanently locked. And then what we found was the workers, they're keen to get in and get out and do their job. They started to shimmy through the handrails. Some of them would duck underneath the handrails in that picture you can see there. Some of them would jump over. We've got an aging workforce. We don't really want them going under, over, or shimmering through these things. This is just not great. We also found that some of the keys were broken, some of the keys went missing, and some of the locks were just obviously generating this unsafe behaviour. So it actually created another risk in the sense that if we did have someone fall into the tanks and we needed to get emergency access in there, it's going to be hard for emergency services to actually access the tanks. So that was the work as imagined. The work as we imagined it, for those who don't necessarily do that task day in, day out, is that we are now safer and we've reduced the drowning risk because of the green locks. Now, we've done the training and, sorry everyone, I don't know if you can hear the really creepy bird noises that are coming from out my backyard there in Australia. Hopefully that's not distracting. So we introduced this concept of work insights, and it was one of our really passionate Safety 2 champions. He was out on site and he conducted one of these work insights, and he just said, look, this is just ridiculous. We've got all this unsafe behaviour that's coming up. And he got together with he pulled the team in and the leaders in and said, look, here's what's happening. Here's the reality of it. It's providing zero control and zero risk management for the risk that we have. So understanding and accepting that reality, it was agreed to pull out the bolt cutters and cut off all of those locks. So we're obviously still maintaining the safety signage and the gates, and we've obviously refreshed the safety access to the site. So while that may seem like a really small initiative, what was really great about this was the empowerment of the frontline staff to identify the challenges that had created from the work as imagined, express the work as done without any fear of retribution or fear that it wouldn't be accepted, and then work collaboratively with the leaders on site to come up with a much better solution that enabled work but also maintained safety. Thanks, Dave, for that next slide. So that process there that Dave's describing, we call it work insights. We also call it critical control work insights around our high-risk work activity. And you can see there that nice black straight line, the work is imagined, the way we think it's happening according to the SOP, or perhaps just our paradigm of how work happens. And then we have that work is done. So that blue line, for those of you who aren't familiar with it, that's squiggling up and down, the little peaks and troughs there are all of the things that our guys absorb in the way of resource constraints, goal conflicts, deadlines, KPIs, which are really tough to meet, irate customers, changes in resources, on and on and on. So all the things that happen day in, day out. You just click that again there, Dave. So in urban utilities, in having rolled this out, we consider our guys to be the experts in their job. And when it comes to safety, they are the masters of the blue line. So it's our guys out there in the rain and in the heat that are absorbing those peaks and troughs there to ensure that everyone is safe. Now, what we've done is developed a process whereby we go out and do work insights, which are just really nice, curious conversations to discover the work is done. We bring that information back, we then aggregate it, we trend it, we analyze it, and we use it as a proactive and predictive indicator of where perhaps we need to put our time and energy and resources and funding, perhaps where we need to be, concerned. Maybe the gap there between the blue and the black line is drift. Maybe we need to be extremely concerned that perhaps we've normalized some deviance and some behavior that isn't ideal. Or maybe the large gap there is actually an innovation that perhaps we can learn from, and maybe we need to change that procedure and that work as imagined. So that's been hugely successful. I've introduced that to the frontline guys, and it just resonates with them. They get it, they understand this model, and now they are out there producing work insights on their high-risk activities and normal everyday work. Thanks, Dave.
Thanks, Kim. So look, if we think about safety too as understanding how work happens and doing everything we can as an organisation to support it going right, and people might say, well, that's not that new and different. And I'd probably argue that in many of our organisations, it actually is. In many of our organisations, like Kim's story with the green locks, we consistently tell our people to do things with not necessarily a lot of regard for what is going to be like for them to live with that. So for example, there is literally thousands of opportunities in your organisation every year for you to add more safety requirements and processes onto the people in your organisation. Every time you do a safety audit, every time you do a safety investigation, every time you have a safety committee meeting, every time you come up with a safety plan, every time you sit in a management meeting and someone comes up with a good idea, every time there's an inspection, we've worked with organisations and inventorized this thing and seen thousands and thousands and thousands of things into their organisation that mostly administrative, and they're just dictated to people in the organisation. Not a lot of thought about how it lands and how it actually gets done, and not necessarily a lot of thought about the outcome and the effectiveness. So when we come at safety from the way that work is being done, and we deeply understand the operational context around work, it really gives us the opportunity to co-design with our people things that are going to be successful. So that green locks wouldn't get put on gates I don't think in urban utilities now, Kim, as they would have 2 years ago, because those things wouldn't happen because the people making those decisions would probably have a deeper operational understanding of the work. And two, anything that was going to be put in like that would be co-designed with the frontline workforce about what's the best way to integrate this change into the work that they do. So this idea of co-design of work practices, and then you can't have that environment if you don't have openness and trust in your workforce, which many of the organizations I work with, they've lost that in the last, they're trying to regain it, but the last 5, 10, 15 years, the disconnection between management and the safety profession and the front line has become quite large. So we talked about, we published a paper about safety clutter because through 4 or 5 research projects, we started seeing all this stuff in organizations that most people in the organization didn't either think about how it worked in terms of helping safety, or they knew it didn't work, yet they didn't do anything about it. And so when we talk about safety clutter, we're sort of going, well, why does this stuff stick around in organizations? And without going into all the detail, what it's really about is understanding the effectiveness of all of our safety processes in our organization. So something practical that you can take away is we talk about the 3 C's for any work practice in your organization. And it's number 1, how much does this contribute to safety? So whatever you're doing for safety, how much does it actually contribute to the safety of work? Number 2 is confidence. How can you be confident about that? Do you have data? Do you have feedback from the people who are exposed to the risk? Do you have the engagement of the people who do the work? And then what's the consensus around that? Do all the stakeholders agree? Does management agree? Does the workforce agree? Does the safety professional agree? Does the technical specialist agree? And if you can go through every one of your safety processes in your organization and think about how much is this contributing? How can I be confident about that? And does everyone agree? Then you're going to have effective safety practices in your organization. We started looking at projects in this space, and it was really fascinating to see just how little value some of the things that we believe work in safety actually did. So we work with some through the university, through Griffith University, where I'm an adjunct fellow of. We were doing some research projects, and we started experimenting with work groups. And so we started taking some of their safety work activities away and having full-time observers on site. So, controlled trial, not randomized, but people didn't know what group they were in and what was being observed of them. But we had observers on site, and we started taking away their permits. We started taking away their pre-start risk assessments, and we started looking at what happened with the work. And interestingly enough, the more safety work we took away, the more safe behaviors showed up during the work activity, and the more compliance to the remaining safety showed up. It was kind of like when people spent half an hour at the start of their job doing a permit, doing a risk assessment, doing all this safety stuff, they almost felt like they'd taken care of what they needed to take care of for safety, and now it was time to get on and make up that half hour and get the work done. And when we took all that away, they were actually displaying more communication with each other, more safe behaviors. They weren't literally jumping across excavations. They were doing more planning activity. So when our researcher was asking, why are you doing that? Oh, well, that's just to have contingency in case something goes wrong. Asking your supervisor, why are you making that phone call? Oh, because this person's not going to know about this information anymore, because normally I'd write it on a report and they get it in 3 days time. But I'm actually telling them now because they're not going to get that report anymore. So communication increased, and all of this stuff, it was, and the more we tried to play around with all of the safety work activities, the more we couldn't actually create the connection that we all assumed was there between a lot of our work processes. So that's what we call decluttering. And we've got a poll up there now about how would you describe your safety management systems? Because this is the big beast. We were recently involved with an organization that had a safety management system that was 56 documents and 700 pages. And we rewrote it into 2 documents and 50 pages just by removing all the stuff that added no value through a long process with their organization. So I might hand over to Kim, because Kim's in the process of doing something equally as big and impactful at Urban Utilities in relation to clutter.
Thanks so much, Dave. We are, oh gosh, we're probably only like really 25% into our decluttering. It's definitely a long process, this one, which is reflective of the size of our safety management system. I highly recommend you read Dave Proven and Drew Ray's published research papers on decluttering. Dave, I can't remember the exact titles, but you know how much I love them and how much you could take these back to your workforce, your leaders, and share it with them. You can build a whole decluttering strategy of Dave's papers alone. So Dave, as I've said before, thank you so much for that contribution to the industry. It's just brilliant. So in commencing our decluttering process, we embarked first of all on a 3-month ethnographic study just to gain really strong insights and detailed, deep insights into the relationship between safety management activities and frontline work. Now, not a lot of health and safety professionals would have the time to have the luxury of going and spend 3 months doing that kind of ethnographic research where you actually are part of a team, part of a work crew. So we invited Yop Havinga from the Safety Science Innovation Lab, and he came out and he was a lab worker and he was out in the sewage treatment plants and he was working night shifts with the responsive maintenance guys, fixing burst water mains and whatnot. And that just gave us a really, really detailed insight into how work actually gets done at urban utilities. It was just brilliant. I'm still working through the findings of that particular study there. So that was really helpful. The second one, thanks Dave, was the safety clutter scorecard. Dave, I don't know if you want to say too much more about the scorecard, but we find it particularly useful. We've done it as a pre-measure to our decluttering, and then we repeat this scorecard annually. Dave, do you want to chime in on the scorecard as to where people can find it and the intent behind it?
Briefly as a tool, we developed a set of questions and scorecard with 20. This is a customized one for QUU, but we came up with about 20 common activities that organizations do, and we threw it up as safetyclutter.com, and you can just kind of like take that questionnaire and then you'll get emailed a PDF kind of report of what your answers is. It's designed to help people start having that conversation with their organization about what is valuable. We've just done it with a really large global oil and gas company. And when things come back that surprise you, like with the whole organization that just say, 75% of people say safety alerts add zero value to improving safety. You kind of got to sit back as a safety professional and go, oh, wow. Like, look at all the stuff and go, half of the people think that this isn't helpful. And look at the things that they say is helpful. Like, I think we need to be far more critical in our roles as safety professionals about what we're doing in our organization to create safety. So thanks, Kim.
Yeah, Dave, you're absolutely right. I'm just looking at our results there, and our safety alerts come at number 18, which I find quite hurtful because I love a good safety alert. Okay, I'm sure there's many of us do, and I do invest a bit of time into safety alerts. So it's a good wake-up call and a chance to be really self-reflective on where we're putting time and energy, even though we love those things. So you can see there from our results, lockout tagout was quite topical at the time. So I think that's why it came in as number 1 as being a key operational activity. We went then through a very, very comprehensive process of collaboration and consultation with the business to redesign our lockout tagout process. But again, this was really interesting for us. Clearly, no surprises there. They don't find the board and executive site visits for safety overly helpful, even though I do spend some of my time organising those. The golden rules were pretty well down there. So yeah, just highly interesting for us. It'll be great when we repeat this soon as our post measure for the year. What that comes up with. So one of the key frustration area, thanks Dave, was our written risk assessments. So this came out of the of Yop's work and also from the Safety Clutter survey, and it was just a constant frustration point for our teams. So our teams in the responsive maintenance part of the business who go out to fix burst water mains, they had to do the written risk assessment every single task, even though the tasks are highly repetitive and very simple in nature. So I'm not talking highly complex tasks where there are additional controls to be put in place. In Australia, it's actually legislated to have that as a written component. I'm just talking about the more simple tasks that they're doing that are highly repetitive. So here's what our guys said about the written risk assessments. They said things like, there's a whole lot of content in there that we need to fill out that isn't relevant. It's a long process that we have to do multiple times per day. Oftentimes customers would get irate at our guys because they would be sitting in the truck filling in the written risk assessment. Meanwhile, there's water pouring down the street, which in Australia is not good, given we're in drought. And so obviously, they obviously get a lot of abuse from customers. Some of them say, look, it just stays in the folder. It's no value, just used to cover your ass, excuse my language, a common term in Australia. The guys will often tell you that. Remove it and it won't change the way we work. Oftentimes the wraps were being done halfway through or at the end of the job. And we actually found a lot of the guys were just pre-filling them in. Now, I'm sure for a lot of you around the world, that is not an uncommon story that you would hear around written risk assessments. Now, the question then begs is, well, what are they doing in relation to thoroughly assessing the risk and putting mitigating controls in place? So what we found through the research was they were doing really good risk assessments. It was just the written component that was just very frustrating to them. So what we did was, through that collaboration co-design process, we removed the written component, obviously still keeping the actual risk assessment in place, and the guys renamed it the chat. If you just flick to the next slide, Dave, that would be great. So the chat is a guided conversation tool. It's got 7 questions that they do in the truck on the way to the job, and that they do when they get out of the truck, once they're unpacking all their tools, to assess the job and the environment, and to pick up on all the risks and whatnot. So the guys co-designed this. We just facilitated the process, and we have now removed that written component of the risk assessment. Now, I can just hear some of you thinking, especially maybe in Australia, maybe in the UK, what about the legalities, the legal side of it? What about our legislative requirement in relation to this? So because I knew that would be a big question that would be asked, and of course we want to make sure that we are still remaining in a legally defensible position, I sought some advice from our favourite safety lawyer here in Australia from Clyde & Co. Thanks, Dave, Michael Toomer. And what the advice was, and what the legislation here in Australia says, is that there's actually no express obligation to implement documented risk management processes in the Australian WHS Act, regs or code of practice. And the obligation actually exists, it relates to proactively managing the risks, which is what our guys were doing anyway, regardless of whether the risk assessment was written or whether it was just a conversation tool. So he then goes on to say that the documentation of that process is only necessary if it assists in traceability of the implementation of those risk controls. Now, the caveat here is there is still a written component if the task is specialised or if it has additional controls in it. So that's what the guys at the end of the shovel think. And we were really happy with that. We were happy that we got the legal advice, because obviously we still care about, we strongly care about what the board think, and they also have a risk to mitigate from their end as well. So we wanted to make sure that what we were doing created safety operationally rather than satisfying the beast of bureaucracy. So in summary there, what I would say then that decluttering is all about for us in a practical sense is it's really about marrying it all up and making sure we're not putting things in place for our operational guys that's actually hindering their safety, as opposed to helping it and enabling their safety. So from Urban Utilities, that's a little bit of a summary about what we've done. We do have a documentary that we produced with Professor Sydney Decker that's on YouTube that you can watch, called Doing Safety Differently. And that goes into a little bit more detail about how our field workers have perceived what we've done in the business, and also the executive as well. So I encourage you to look at that. So really, in essence, what this is all about is taking that theory and matching it and making it practical, interpreting it for your business. I can't say that you could take the things that we've done at Urban Utilities and plug and play them in your organisation. I would say it's about doing a lot of research yourself and synthesising that information and taking it back to your business and having that conversation with them to see how it actually works in the business. And ultimately, why would we do that? I believe my greatest passion is because ultimately safety is an ethical responsibility for our frontline workers, not just a bureaucratic accountability for a few people. So that's it in a nutshell from me. Dave, I don't know if you've got any closing points. I'm assuming that everyone's popping all their Q&A into the chat box there. So Dave and I will be online for the next 15 minutes or so to answer any questions. So
yeah, Dave? I'd just say, just before we do questions, I think, Kim, just to round off on that last poll, I just want to leave kind of 2 messages. The first would be, because I saw like 47% of people said that their safety management system is designed for compliance or certification, sort of primarily. And when we started doing the safety clutter work, we said, what's the barrier for people removing things in their organisation, like Kim did with the risk assessment? And 2/3 of the people, over 400 or 500 people that responded, said 2/3 people said legal compliance, and only 1/3 said their biggest worry was actually hurting people. So I think as a profession, we're in a real identity crisis. Like, is our job really about designing stuff to suit laws and certification? Is our job really designing stuff to suit management? Or is our job to design stuff that is our customer, the people that are exposed to the risk? And so when I talk to people, I always say your customer is the people exposed to the risk, and the safety of the work is always more important than the safety work that's being directed by the organisation. So they're probably the two things I'd like to leave everyone with, and then love to hear any and all questions.